To understand the end of the story, with its concrete shadows and chemical fires, we must first drift back to the very beginning, to a time when the world was younger and the silence was deeper. We must travel not to a street corner or a laboratory, but to the roof of the Western Hemisphere, where the Earth thrusts itself upward to commune with the stars. Long before the concrete canyons of modern cities were filled with the smoke of this tragic chemistry, the story began in the high, thin air of the South American Cordilleras. Picture, if you will, a landscape of mist and stone, where the Andes Mountains scrape the belly of the sky, creating a realm that seems less like a part of the earth and more like a bridge to the heavens. Here, the air is so thin that it demands a different kind of breathing, a deliberate and rhythmic intake of life. The sunlight here does not merely shine. It strikes with a pristine, ultraviolet intensity, unfiltered by the heavy atmosphere that blankets the lowlands. It is a place of extremes, of jagged basalt peaks crowned in eternal snow, and steep, terraced valleys that plunge into the verdant humidity of the cloud forests below. It is in this liminal space, this borderland between the freezing void of the peaks and the sweltering heat of the jungle, that a botanical miracle occurred. Here, for thousands of years, the Erythroxylum coca plant was not a scourge, but a sacred gift. It was the emerald breath of the mountains, a green leaf chewed by the indigenous people to ward off the biting cold and the fatigue of high-altitude labor. Imagine the prehistoric silence of these valleys, broken only by the cry of a condor or the rush of glacial meltwater tumbling over gray stones. In this harsh and beautiful cradle, the coca bush evolved. It is a resilient shrub, unassuming in its appearance, with oval leaves that gleam with a waxy sheen, designed by nature to retain moisture against the dry winds. It grows where few other crops can thrive, clinging to the steep slopes of the Yungas, the warm valleys that fold into the eastern flank of the Andes. To the botanist, it is a specimen of efficiency. To the Andean, it was, and remains, the physical embodiment of a mother's care. It was an offering to the earth, a gentle stimulant that allowed civilizations to build stone temples above the clouds. The relationship between the human being and this plant is one of the oldest intimacies in the history of the Americas. Archaeologists, sifting through the dust of coastal caves and high mountain tombs, have found remnants of coca leaves alongside human remains dating back thousands of years, long before the rise of the Inca, long before the pyramids of Egypt were sketched into the sand. This suggests a profound truth, that as soon as humanity ventured into these heights, they found this leaf waiting for them. It was as if the landscape itself had provided a key, a chemical tool, to unlock the ability to survive in a place where the oxygen is scarce and the cold is a physical weight upon the shoulders. In these ancient times, the leaf was held in the hands of shamans and workers alike, treated with a reverence reserved for the divine. There was no violence in its veins, only the slow, rhythmic pulse of nature. The wind would rustle through the terrace farms, whispering secrets of stamina and spiritual connection. It is important to remember this innocence, to see the leaf as it was intended, a botanical companion to humanity in a harsh environment. It was merely a plant, basking in the sun, unaware that centuries later, far away in northern laboratories, its spirit would be stripped, distilled, and distorted into something the shamans would no longer recognize. But let us not rush to the tragedy. Let us stay here, in the golden light of the pre-Columbian world, where the leaf is still whole and the world is still quiet. The act of consuming this leaf was not a vice, but a ritual of daily survival and social bonding. It was not swallowed, nor burned, nor injected. It was, and is, chewed. But even the word chew is too crude for the process. In the Quechua language, the act is known as chachar, or akuliko. It is a slow, meditative process. Picture an Aymara herdsman wrapped in the wool of the alpaca, sitting on a rocky outcrop overlooking a valley that stretches into infinity. He takes a small handful of dried leaves from a woven pouch, a chuspa, which hangs at his side. He selects the leaves with care, removing the stems, and places them one by one into the cheek. But the leaf alone is locked. Its alkaloids are trapped within the cellular structure, dormant and waiting. To release the spirit of the plant, a catalyst is needed. The herdsman adds a small pinch of lipta, or eluctan alkaline substance made from the ashes of quinoa stalks, or crushed seashells, or the burnt limestone of the mountains. This is the ancient chemistry, the first extraction. The alkalinity softens the leaves and allows the saliva to extract the essence. A mild numbness spreads through the mouth, a sensation not of intoxication, but of awakening. The hunger that gnaws at the belly fades away. The fatigue that settles in the muscles dissolves. The cold wind feels less biting. The mind clears, sharpening into a state of calm, focused endurance. This was the gift of the plant, not an escape from reality, but the strength to endure it. In a world without wheels, without beasts of burden strong enough to carry men, the human body was the engine of civilization. It was the coca leaf that fueled the legs of the travelers walking the Capac Ñan, the great Inca road that spanned thousands of miles along the spine of the continent. It was coca that allowed the stonemasons to work the massive granite blocks of Sacsayhuaman, fitting them together with such precision that not even a blade of grass could pass between them. These structures, which still stand today in defiance of earthquakes and time, are in many ways monuments to the energy provided by this small green leaf. But the utility of the plant was inseparable from its spirituality. In the Andean cosmology, everything is alive. The mountains are apus, great spirits that watch over the people. The earth is Pachamama, the world mother who sustains all life. And coca was the mediator between the human realm and these powerful forces. It was the currency of the spiritual world. No ceremony could begin without it. Before a journey, a man might blow on a set of 3 perfect leaves, akin to offering his breath and the essence of the plant to the mountain peaks in the distance, asking for safe passage. To share the contents of one's chuspa with a stranger was a universal sign of friendship and peace, a diplomatic gesture that predated the handshake. In the intricate mythology of the Andes, there are stories that whisper of the plant's divine origins. One legend speaks of a beautiful woman named Cuca, who was executed for her ability to seduce and entrance men. From her grave sprouted the first bush, a plant that would continue to entrance and comfort humanity forever. Another story tells of the sun god, Inti, gifting the plant to his children after the Great Flood, telling them it would help them endure the cold and the hunger that would plague their lives on earth. It was told that the plant was intended only for the children of the sun, and that if the pale strangers from across the sea ever touched it, it would become a poison to them. It is a chilling prophecy, one that history would eventually prove true with a terrible accuracy. Let us drift further into the golden age of the Inca, the Tawantinsuyu, the realm of the 4 parts together. Here, the cultivation of coca was organized and elevated. While the common folk used it for labor, the finest leaves were reserved for the nobility and the priesthood. The emperor himself, the Sapa Inca, was considered a divine being, and the coca leaf was his royal privilege. Gold and silver were plentiful in the Andes. They were the sweat of the sun and the tears of the moon, used for beauty and decoration. But they could not be eaten. They offered no warmth. And so, in many ways, coca was more valuable than gold. It was a form of currency, used to pay taxes, to trade for goods from the jungle or the coast, and to reward loyal service. Picture the great storehouses, the kulkas, built along the mountain roads. They were filled with freeze-dried potatoes, maize, woven textiles, and baskets of dried coca leaves. This was the wealth of the empire, a wealth based on sustenance and survival. The runners, the chasquis, who carried messages across the vast empire, relied entirely on the leaf. A chasqui might run for miles at a dead sprint at an altitude where a modern athlete would collapse. He carried no food, only his pouch of leaves. He was a human arrow shot across the mountains, fueled by the green alkaloid. When he arrived at the next relay station, breathless and exhausted, the message was passed, and the first thing he would reach for was the leaf, to restore the balance of his body. The spiritual life of the empire also revolved around the plant. The Atiri, the wise ones and healers, used coca for divination. They would cast the leaves onto a woven cloth and read the future in the way they fell. Did they land face up or face down? Did they cluster together or scatter apart? The leaves spoke the language of destiny. If a child was sick, the diagnosis began with the leaves. If a war was to be fought, the outcome was sought in the patterns of green on the textile. In the mummified bundles of the ancestors, preserved in the arid caves of the high deserts, archaeologists find pouches of coca tucked into the folds of the burial shrouds. Even in death, the Andean soul required the comfort of the leaf for the long journey into the afterlife. This was the world of the leaf for millennia, a world of integration, reverence, and balance. It was a symbiotic relationship between a people and their environment. The plant was not a master, and the human was not a slave. They were partners in the difficult business of living in a beautiful but unforgiving landscape. The alkaloid content of the leaf in its natural state is low, perhaps 1% or less. When chewed with lime, the release is slow and steady, a gentle lift akin to a strong cup of coffee, but smoother, more sustained. There was no high in the modern sense, no rush of euphoria followed by a crashing despair. There was only maintenance, a restoration of equilibrium. But history is a river that flows toward change, and in the year 1532, a new current entered the waters. The Spanish conquest arrived with the clangor of steel and the thunder of gunpowder. The men who came from across the ocean were driven by a hunger for gold, a hunger so voracious that it blinded them to the subtleties of the world they were invading. At first, the Catholic priests who accompanied the conquistadors looked upon the coca leaf with suspicion and disgust. They saw the indigenous people with their cheeks bulging, green juice staining their lips, murmuring prayers to mountains and stones. To the European eye, this was the devil's work. It was a barrier to conversion, a pagan talisman that kept the people tethered to their old gods. In the mid-16th century, there were edicts passed to ban the leaf. The Council of Lima denounced it as a delusion of the devil. They sought to rip the plant from the soil and from the culture, but the conquistadors soon discovered a pragmatic and brutal truth. Without the leaf, the indigenous people could not work. The Spanish had enslaved the population, forcing them into the mines to extract the silver that would bankroll the Spanish Empire. But the work in the mines was a descent into hell. In the deep, suffocating tunnels of Potosi, the mountain that eats men, the air was foul, the darkness absolute, and the labor backbreaking. The Spanish overseers realized that without coca, the workers died of exhaustion or despair. With coca, they could work for days with little food and little sleep. And so, the moral outrage of the church gave way to the economic greed of the empire. The leaf was not only legalized, it was commercialized. The Spanish seized the coca plantations, the cocals, which had once been the property of the Inca nobility. They began to tax it, to distribute it, to use it as a tool of control. The sacred leaf, once an offering to the gods, became the fuel for the colonial machine. Picture the tragedy of this transition. The plant that had been a symbol of community and spiritual connection was now a mechanism of exploitation. The indigenous miner, descending into the dark bowels of Potosi, chewed the leaf not to commune with the upper world, but to endure the underworld. He chewed to numb the pain of the lash and the ache of the pickaxe. The emerald breath of the Andes had become a gasp for air in the suffocating dark. Yet, even in this degradation, the plant remained a comfort. It was the one link to the old ways, the one friend in the darkness. For centuries, this remained the status of the plant. It was a curiosity to the West, a local habit of the South American tribes, largely ignored by the rest of the world. Europe was enamored with tobacco, with coffee, with tea stimulants they had extracted from other corners of the globe. Coca remained locked in the Andes, protected by the very geography that birthed it. The leaves did not travel well. They spoiled on the long sea voyages across the Atlantic, losing their potency and turning into a rotting mulch. This fragility was a natural safeguard, a barrier that kept the alkaloid sequestered in its home. But the Age of Enlightenment brought with it a new kind of hunger, not for gold, but for knowledge, for categorization, and for extraction. The Western mind sought to isolate the essence of things, to break nature down into its constituent parts to understand and master it. In the 19th century, explorers and naturalists began to bring better preserved samples of the leaf back to the laboratories of Europe. They were fascinated by the stories of the Indian who could run for days without eating. They wanted to find the ghost in the machine, the specific molecule responsible for this miracle. We are approaching the moment of rupture, the moment where the history of the plant splinters. But before we leave the mountains, let us take one last look at the leaf in its natural state. See it glistening with the morning dew in a valley of the Yungas. It is vibrant, alive, part of a complex ecosystem of soil, sun, rain, and shadow. It contains vitamins, minerals, and a host of alkaloids that work in concert. It is a whole thing. It was never meant to be shattered. The shamans say that every plant has a spirit, and the spirit of coca is a jealous and powerful mother. Treated with respect, she is a guide and a healer. Treated with disrespect, she becomes a confused and vengeful ghost. As the 19th century dawned, the world was about to treat her with the ultimate disrespect. They were about to strip her of her body, discard the vitamins and the buffers, and isolate the single, volatile molecule of pleasure and power hidden within. But in the high Andes, time moves slower than in the cities of men. The mountains do not care for the passing of empires. The wind still blows through the stone terraces, the condor still circles the thermals, and the descendants of the Inca still reach into their woven pouches, selecting 3 perfect leaves to offer to the earth before placing them in their mouths. For them, the pact remains unbroken. They remember what the rest of the world has forgotten, that some gifts are meant to be held gently, and that to demand too much from nature is to invite a reckoning. The sun sets over the Cordillera, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of violet and gold. The air grows cold, and the silence returns, heavy and profound. This is the cradle. This is the beginning. The emerald leaf sleeps on the branch, dreaming of the sun, unaware of the nightmares that will be born from its bones in the laboratories of the future. The story of the leaf is a tragedy of alchemy, a transformation from the sacred to the profane. But here, in the thin air, it is still just a plant. It is innocent. And it is waiting. As we drift away from the mountains, leaving the high stone paths and the cloud forests behind, we move toward the smoke and the glass of the modern age. But we carry with us the memory of the mist. We understand now that what comes later, the white dust, the cracked cities, the broken lives, was not the fault of the earth. The earth gave a medicine. Man, in his hubris, turned it into a poison. The journey from the mountains to the laboratory is a journey of extraction, and in extracting the essence, we lost the soul. Let the image of the green terraces fade into the twilight. Let the sound of the wind die down. The ancient world sleeps, holding its secrets close. The emerald breath of the Andes rises into the night sky, a prayer that was heard and then twisted by a world that had forgotten how to listen. The Atlantic Ocean is a vast and temperamental divide, a shifting plain of gray water that has swallowed ships and secrets for as long as humanity has dared to cross it. In the mid-19th century, this ocean became the bridge between 2 worlds that were destined to collide in a chemistry of tragedy and triumph. The emerald leaf of the Andes, the sacred erythroxylum, was torn from the soil of its ancestors and placed into the wooden holds of European merchant vessels. For centuries, the leaf had refused to travel. It was a stubborn passenger. On the long, humid voyages across the equator, the leaves would rot, turning into a black, fermented mulch, their potency vanishing into the salt air as if the spirit of the plant refused to leave the protection of the mountains. But the scientific mind of the West is defined by a refusal to accept the boundaries of nature. It is driven by a hunger to capture, to preserve, and to isolate. As the wheel of time turned toward the industrial age, the methods of transport improved, and the preservation techniques grew more sophisticated. The leaf arrived in the damp ports of London, Hamburg, and Paris, not as a fresh, living thing, but as a dried botanical specimen, ready for the interrogation of the laboratory. It was entering the age of the glass beaker and the Bunsen burner, a time when men believed that the chaotic soul of nature could be distilled into a single, pure, mathematical equation. The sanctity of the mountains was exchanged for the sterile glass of the Western laboratory. The wind of the Andes was replaced by the hiss of gas lamps and the smell of sulfur and ether. In the university town of Göttingen, Germany, in the year 1860, a doctoral student named Albert Niemann stood over a collection of these dried leaves. The setting is important to visualize: a room of dark wood and brass filled with the intricate plumbing of early chemistry. It was a place of shadows and concentrated light, where retorts bubbled with colored liquids and the air was thick with the acrid perfume of experimentation. Niemann was not a shaman, he was a scientist, a man of the Enlightenment. He did not ask the plant for permission, he demanded its secrets. Driven by the era's obsession with isolation and purity, he sought to find the specific molecule that gave the leaf its power. The process was a kind of violent refinement. He subjected the leaves to alcohol, to sulfuric acid, to lime and water. He stripped away the fiber, the water, and the protective wax. He dissolved the chlorophyll, the very greenness of the plant, until all that remained was the chemical essence. Slowly, through a process of evaporation and filtration, a precipitate began to form in his beaker. It was not green. It was not organic in appearance. It was a fine, crystalline powder, white as the driven snow of the Alps, glittering under the laboratory gaslight. He had successfully extracted the alkaloid soul of the plant. He named it cocaine. When Niemann tasted this new creation, placing a microscopic amount on his tongue, he felt a strange, distinctive numbness. It was a cold fire, a silencing of the nerves. This was the first time in history that the pure hydrochloride salt had existed. It was a concentration of energy that nature had never intended to exist in such a singular form. In the leaf, the alkaloid is balanced by vitamins, minerals, and other compounds that modulate its absorption. It is a gentle wave. In the crystal, it is a rogue wave, a tsunami of potency. But in 1860, this danger was invisible. The white dust arrived not as a monster, but as a miracle of modern medicine, shimmering with the promise of a pain-free future. To understand the magnitude of this discovery, one must remember the horror of medicine before anesthesia. For millennia, surgery was a torture chamber. The surgeon's skill was measured by his speed, for his patient was awake, strapped to a table, screaming in agony. The discovery of ether and chloroform had begun to silence the screams, but there was still no way to numb a specific part of the body without rendering the patient unconscious. This was particularly true for the delicate, terrifying art of eye surgery. A patient undergoing cataract surgery had to remain perfectly still while a blade cut into their eye, yet they could feel every incision. It was a procedure of unimaginable stress for both the doctor and the sufferer. Enter Dr. Karl Kohler, a young colleague of Sigmund Freud in Vienna. In 1884, he dissolved a pinch of Niemann's white dust in distilled water and placed a few drops into the eye of a frog. He waited, watching the amphibian in the dim light of the study. Then he touched the eye with a needle. The frog did not blink. It did not recoil. The eye was frozen in a state of painless indifference. Kohler tried it on himself, touching the needle to his own cornea. He felt nothing. It was a moment of profound medical magic. The local anesthetic was born. The news spread across the world via telegraph, the Victorian internet, electrifying the medical community. Suddenly, The white dust was the most precious substance in the pharmacopoeia. It was hailed as a gift from God, a silencer of pain, a mercy for the afflicted. It shimmered under the gaslights of Victorian operating rooms, where surgeons could now work with the precision of watchmakers, unhurried by the patient's thrashing. It was used in dentistry, in throat surgery, in childbirth. The miracle was real, but the miracle had a shadow, a seduction that extended far beyond the operating table. Imagine the turn of the century, the fin de siècle, the Gilded Age. It was a time of immense wealth, rapid industrialization, and a peculiar cultural malady known as neurasthenia, a nervous exhaustion attributed to the frantic pace of modern life. The steam engine, the stock ticker, the electric light, all these inventions were driving humanity to a state of chronic fatigue. The elites of Europe and America, the men in top hats and the women in corsets, were tired. They were anxious. And here, in a small crystal vial, was the antidote. The white dust began to migrate from the surgeon's kit to the apothecary's shelf, and from there to the drawing rooms of the aristocracy. It was celebrated as a cure-all, a tonic for the melancholy of the age. It was not seen as a drug in the modern pejorative sense, but as a brain food, a substance that could clarify the mind and banish fatigue. The most famous intellectual of the era, Sigmund Freud, became its evangelist. He wrote a song of praise to the substance, creating a paper titled Über Coca. In his letters to his fiancée, Martha, he spoke of the gorgeous excitement it provided, describing himself as a wild man, empowered by the dust. He recommended it to his friends, to his patients, to his sisters. He believed, with a tragic sincerity, that it was a cure for morphine addiction, for depression, for gastric upset. He did not know that he was opening a door that he would later struggle desperately to close. But the seduction was not limited to the intellectual circles of Vienna. It became a commercial sensation. Enter Angelo Mariani, a Corsican chemist with a flair for marketing that would rival any modern ad executive. He took the finest Bordeaux wine and infused it with the coca leaf extract. He called it Vin Mariani. It was a deep, ruby-red elixir, bottled in elegant glass, promised to restore health, strength, energy, and vitality. It was an immediate, global phenomenon. Picture the grand boulevards of Paris in the 1890s, the cafes filled with artists, writers, and politicians. On the tables, amidst the absinthe and the coffee, stood the bottle of Vin Mariani. It was the drink of the creative genius. Jules Verne sipped it while dreaming of submarines and moon rockets. Alexander Dumas drank it while penning his swashbuckling tales. But the endorsement went even higher. Two popes, Leo XIII and St. Pius X, were devoted consumers. Pope Leo XIII was so enamored with the tonic that he appeared on a poster endorsing it and awarded Mariani a gold medal from the Vatican. Imagine the irony, deep and profound. The vicar of Christ on earth, the spiritual leader of millions, bestowing a holy blessing upon a mixture of alcohol and cocaine. This specific combination alcohol and cocaine creates a unique chemical in the human liver known as coca-ethylene. It is far more potent and euphoric than cocaine alone. The Vin Mariani was not just a wine, it was a liquid superdrug, a chemical reaction in a bottle that produced a profound sense of well-being, confidence, and invincibility. It was the fuel of the Belle Époque, the hidden energy behind the artistic and architectural explosions of the late 19th century. It was dusted into wines and sodas, consumed by popes and psychoanalysts who praised its ability to clarify the mind. Across the ocean, in the bustling, recovering nation of the United States, the white dust found an even more iconic home. In the post-Civil War South, a wounded Confederate veteran named John Stith Pemberton was searching for relief. He was a morphine addict, a man in constant pain from a saber wound to the chest. He heard of the miracle wine from France but wanted to create an American version, a temperance drink that could offer the same relief without the alcohol. In a brass kettle in Atlanta, Georgia, he mixed the extract of the coca leaf with the extract of the cola nut, a source of caffeine, and sugar syrup. He called it Coca-Cola. The soda fountain of the late 19th century was the social hearth of the American city. It was a place of marble counters, polished brass spigots, and mirrors. Here, the weary businessman, the exhausted housewife, and the curious student would gather to drink the intellectual beverage and temperance drink. It cost 5 cents. It contained a significant dose of cocaine. It was marketed as a cure for headaches, for hysteria, for melancholy. It was the pause that refreshes. The American dream was being fueled, in part, by the alkaloid of the Andes. But this refinement was a dangerous alchemy. By removing the plant's natural buffers, humanity had created a concentration of energy that the human spirit was ill-equipped to handle. In the mountains, the chewer of the leaf receives a slow, steady trickle of the drug, regulated by the fiber and the digestion. It is a walk up a gentle slope. The refined powder, however, is an elevator that rockets to the penthouse in seconds. The brain is flooded with dopamine, the neurotransmitter of reward and survival. It tells the user, "This is good. This is important. Do this again." The tragedy began to unfold slowly, like a crack in a dam. The miracle cure began to show its teeth. The first casualties were the doctors themselves. William Halsted, the father of modern surgery, the man who invented the residency system and the use of sterile gloves, was a secret captive of the white dust. He had experimented on himself to prove the efficacy of local anesthesia and found himself unable to stop. His brilliant career was shadowed by unexplained absences, by erratic behavior, by a desperate struggle to maintain the facade of the great man, while his soul was being hollowed out by the powder. He was the canary in the coal mine, but few were listening to the song. Freud, too, saw the darkness. His friend, Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow, whom Freud had treated for morphine addiction using cocaine, developed a horrific psychosis. He hallucinated that white snakes were crawling under his schiena condition known as formication, or coke bugs. He died in agony, a victim of the cure. Freud burned his papers on cocaine and never spoke publicly of it again, a silence that hung heavy over his legacy. The Gilded Age was a time of surfaces, of gold leaf covering rot, of velvet curtains hiding poverty. And cocaine fit this era perfectly. It was the beginning of a great seduction, a glittery, expensive habit of the upper classes, hidden behind velvet curtains and gold-rimmed spectacles. It was a drug of the ego, a drug that whispered to the user that they were a god, that they were smarter, faster, and more charming than any mortal. It fed the hubris of the industrial titans. It was the secret companion in the pocket of the waistcoat, the little silver box on the vanity table. The powder was soft, quiet, and insidious. It did not make men stumble like whiskey. It made them sharp. It did not make them nod off like opium. It made them talk. It mimicked the very qualities that the West valued most: productivity, alertness, and confidence. It was the perfect drug for a capitalist society obsessed with growth. But the debt was accruing. The brain, bombarded by this artificial stimulation, began to down-regulate its own production of pleasure. The highs became lower, the lows became deeper. The tonic became a necessity. The recreational habit became a chain. As the 19th century bled into the 20th, the atmosphere began to shift. The stories of cocaine fiends began to appear in the newspapers, often tinged with the racism and fear of the era. The drug, once the darling of the salon, began to drift down the social ladder. It moved from the crystal decanters of the rich to the back alleys of the cities. The government, once happy to tax the miracle cures, began to look with alarm at the monster they had unleashed. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 was looming on the horizon, a legislative iron gate that would attempt to cage the genie. But for now, let us linger in this strange twilight of legality. Picture the world at the turn of the century, a world lit by gas and early electric bulbs, where shadows are long and flickering. The transatlantic liners are docking in New York, unloading crates of medicinal wines. The pharmacies are open late, the soda fountains are hissing with carbonation. The world is vibrating with a manic energy, unaware that it is dancing on the edge of a precipice. The white dust sits in its jars, innocent in appearance like sugar or salt. It is biding its time. It has conquered the operating room, seduced the Pope, and energized the American South. But it has not yet revealed its true face. The alchemy is not yet complete. The powder is still a luxury, a toy for the wealthy, a tool for the doctor. It has not yet learned to boil. It has not yet learned to turn into a rock. That transformation awaits in the future, in a different century, in a different economic climate. For now, the snow falls gently on the Gilded Age, covering the cracks in the pavement, numbing the pain of a rapidly changing world. It is the calm before the chemical storm. As the chapter closes, imagine a Victorian gentleman sitting in his leather armchair by the fire. He is tired from the day's business. He reaches into his pocket and withdraws a small, ornate snuff box. He takes a pinch of the white powder, inhaling it with a refined, practiced gesture. He leans back and the fatigue dissolves. The fire looks brighter. The future looks golden. He closes his eyes, feeling the false warmth of the alkaloid, unaware that he is caressing the cheek of a demon that will one day devour cities. The emerald breath of the Andes has become the white ghost of the West, and the ghost is hungry. Time is a quiet architect, building and dismantling empires while the world sleeps. Between the gaslit parlors of the Victorian age and the neon-soaked horizons of the late 20th century, the world underwent a metamorphosis. The wars of steel and trench mud passed. The atomic age dawned with a blinding white light, and the cultural revolutions of the 60s bloomed and withered like wildflowers in a storm. Through all these shifting tectonic plates of history, the white powder waited. It had retreated from the pharmacy shelves and the soda fountains, banned by the laws of men, forced into the shadows of the underworld. It became a whisper, a secret handshake in the jazz clubs of Harlem and the avant-garde salons of Paris. But it never truly vanished. It merely slept, like a seed beneath the snow, waiting for the climate to change. By the late 1970s, the climate had not only changed, it had become tropical. The center of the world's desire shifted from the austere gray of the post-war years to the technicolor excess of the disco era. It was a time of mirrored balls, synthetic fabrics, and a desperate, driving hunger for sensation. And, to feed this hunger, the emerald leaf of the Andes was called upon once more. But this time, it did not travel in the polite wooden holds of merchant ships bound for European medical labs. It traveled in the bellies of aluminum birds and the hulls of cigarette boats, cutting through the turquoise waters of the Caribbean. The trade of this white powder had become a global river, flowing from the south to the north in torrents that could not be stemmed. Picture, if you will, the geography of this new trade routes. It is a map drawn not in ink, but in radar blips and secret airstrips. To the south lay the source, the verdant, mist-covered mountains of Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. There, the lords of the south, the new emperors of the trade, had industrialized the ancient process. They had taken the humble kitchen chemistry of the 19th century and scaled it up to the size of factories. Deep in the jungle, hidden beneath the canopy of ancient trees, laboratories hummed with the sound of generators and the smell of ether. They were producing tons, not grams. They were turning the sacred leaf into a commodity as ubiquitous as sugar and far more valuable than gold. Between this source and the hungry markets of North America lay the Caribbean Sea, a vast, shimmering expanse of blue that has always been a corridor for pirates and privateers. In the 17th century, it was Spanish galleons carrying silver. In the 1970s, it was twin-engine Cessnas carrying the white dust. Imagine the view from the cockpit of one of these small planes, flying low over the waves to avoid the radar net. The moon is full and heavy, hanging like a lantern over the ocean. The water below is a sheet of hammered silver. The pilot is alone in the dark, guided only by the faint glow of his instruments and the distant lights of the Florida coast. He is a modern-day smuggler, a courier of the chemical age, carrying a cargo that will alter the consciousness of a nation. These pilots, often veterans of foreign wars or daredevils seeking the thrill of the edge, were the capillaries of the system. They landed on makeshift airstrips carved into the limestone of Bahamian islands, places with names like Norman's Key, which became private kingdoms of illicit logistics. Here the planes would refuel, the cargo would be transferred, and the pilots would rest under the swaying palms, drinking rum and counting stacks of cash that smelled of aviation fuel and mildew. It was a time of chaotic romance, a wild west on the high seas, where the laws of the mainland dissolved into the salt air. The destination for this river of white was the peninsula of Florida, specifically the city of Miami. In the early 1980s, Miami was transforming from a sleepy retirement haven into the Magic City, a glittering, dangerous metropolis built on the foundations of this new economy. The skyline began to rise, fueled by the influx of narco dollars. Banks popped up on every corner, their vaults overflowing with cash that needed to be laundered, washed clean of its illicit origins. The air in Miami was thick with humidity and money. The sunsets were violent explosions of purple and orange, reflecting off the glass towers and the white hoods of luxury cars. It was here, in the VIP rooms of nightclubs and the penthouses of Art Deco hotels, that the powder found its home. It became the champagne of drugs, the ultimate status symbol for a generation obsessed with wealth and power. It was the fuel of Wall Street, the muse of Hollywood, the companion of the rock star. To offer a guest a line of the white dust was the ultimate gesture of hospitality and affluence. It was consumed through rolled $100 bills cut on mirrors with platinum razor blades. It was a drug of the ego, reinforcing the feeling that the user was the center of the universe, invincible and golden. But a curious economic phenomenon occurred, a shifting of the tides that would alter history. The lords of the South were too efficient. Their supply chains were too robust. They had built a machine that produced more product than the elite market could absorb. By 1982, the skies over the Caribbean were crowded with planes. The warehouses in Miami were stacked floor to ceiling with kilo bricks, wrapped in plastic and duct tape. The market became flooded. There was simply too much powder arriving on the humid breezes of the Florida coast, more than the wealthy enclaves could consume. In the classic laws of economics, supply and demand are the gravity that governs the market. When supply outstrips demand, the value plummets. And this is exactly what began to happen. The wholesale price of cocaine, which had been astronomically high, began to drop. The drug was losing its exclusivity. It was no longer just for the movie star and the banker. It was trickling down to the middle manager, the lawyer, the suburbanite. But even this expansion was not enough to stem the tide. The cartels were drowning in their own product. They were sitting on stockpiles of inventory that were losing value by the day. They faced a crisis of logistics and profitability. They needed a new vessel for their merchandise. This is the moment where the story turns from a tale of luxury to a tale of devastation. It is the pivot point, the fulcrum upon which the fate of millions would balance. The cartels and the distributors realized they needed to open new markets. They needed to reach the hands of those who could not afford the expensive dust of the disco era. They needed a product that was sold not by the gram, which cost hundreds of dollars, but by the unit, which could cost only a few dollars. They needed to democratize the experience, to lower the barrier of entry so that the floodwaters could wash into the streets of the working class and the poor. But there was a chemical problem. Cocaine hydrochloride, the white powder that had captivated the Victorian age and the disco era, is a salt. It is water-soluble. It is designed to be absorbed through the mucous membranes of the nose or dissolved in a drink. It cannot be smoked effectively. If you apply a flame to the powder, it burns and destroys the alkaloid before it can vaporize. The heat ruins the magic. To smoke cocaine, to get it into the lungs where it can hit the brain with the force of a sledgehammer, you must change its chemical structure. You must remove the hydrochloride molecule. you must free the base. In the late 1970s, a method known as freebasing had emerged among the connoisseurs of the drug. It was a dangerous, volatile ritual. It involved mixing the powder with ether and heat. Ether is highly flammable, a heavy gas that creeps along the floor and can ignite with the spark of a lighter. There were stories of explosions, of celebrities setting themselves on fire, of faces scarred by the sudden wrath of the chemicals. It was a process for the brave or the foolish, and it required equipment and time. It was not a method for the street corner. It was an alchemist's experiment restricted to the glass tables of the Hollywood Hills. But necessity is the mother of dark invention. Somewhere in the hidden laboratories, or perhaps in a simple kitchen in the Caribbean or California, a discovery was made. A simpler way, a safer way, a way that required no ether, no complex glassware, no danger of explosion. The chemistry had to change, but the solution was deceptively domestic. It was a moment of dark innovation, born of greed and logistics. The recipe was elemental: water, baking soda, heat, and the white powder. Picture the scene, not in a high-tech lab, but in a dimly lit kitchen. A pot of water sits on a stove. The flame is blue and steady. The powder is poured in, swirling like snow in a pond. Then, the baking soda, sodium bicarbonate, a common ingredient found in every pantry for baking cookies, is added. A reaction occurs. The mixture bubbles and hisses. It is a purgation. The hydrochloride salt binds with the baking soda and dissolves, leaving the pure cocaine alkaloid to separate from the water. It clumps together, forming oily, solid curds that float to the top. As the water cools, these curds harden. They become rocks. They are off-white, jagged, resembling small stones or pieces of gravel. They are durable. They are heat-resistant. And, most importantly, they are smokable. When a flame is applied to this rock, it does not burn, it sublimates. It turns into a thick, white vapor that can be inhaled deeply into the lungs. And because the lungs have a massive surface area, the drug enters the bloodstream instantly, bypassing the slow route of the nose. The effect is no longer a gentle rise, it is a vertical takeoff. This was the birth of the product that would come to be known by the sound it made when heated. The crackle of the breaking chemical bonds, the snap of the crystal. Crack. But in these early days, it was just a solution to a surplus problem. It was a way to package the drug in tiny, affordable amounts. A kilo of powder could be cooked down into thousands of rocks. A single rock could be sold for a few dollars. Suddenly, the price of admission to the world of euphoria dropped from the price of a car to the price of a meal. The stage was set for a chemical reaction that would move from the hidden laboratories to the kitchen stovetop, a democratization of destruction that was about to sweep through the unsuspecting streets. The cartels had found their solution. The flood of powder that had been backed up in the warehouses of Miami now had a new form. It could be distributed anywhere, by anyone. It didn't require a scale to weigh, you just counted the rocks. It was the ultimate fast-moving consumer good. But the world was not ready. The cities were not ready. The human brain was not ready. The shift from the nasal powder to the smoked rock was not just a change in delivery method, it was a change in the fundamental relationship between the human and the chemical. The powder was a seduction. The rock was a seizure. The powder whispered, the rock screamed. The surplus that had gathered in the Caribbean, sitting in crates under the heavy moon of the tropics, was about to be unleashed as a tsunami. As the sun sets over the port of Miami in 1983, imagine the ships bobbing in the harbor, the cranes standing like iron giraffes against the purple sky. The city is vibrant, pulsing with the beat of salsa and synth pop. The tourists walk along Ocean Drive, admiring the Art Deco pastel buildings. But underneath the pavement, in the shadows of the alleyways, the new product is beginning to circulate. It is moving from hand to hand. It is small, unassuming, looking like a piece of dropped drywall or a pebble from a garden. But inside that small stone lies the concentrated energy of the Andes, stripped of its spirit, stripped of its history, and compressed into a weapon of mass addiction. The Caribbean tide had brought the water to the shore, but the surplus was about to break the dam. The era of the high life was ending. The era of the epidemic was beginning. The wind picks up, rustling the palm fronds, carrying the scent of salt and impending rain. The air is heavy, charged with the static of a storm that is not yet broken, but is inevitable. The chemistry has changed, the economy has shifted, and in the quiet homes of the inner cities, the stove burners are being lit, one by one, preparing to cook the recipe that will break the heart of a nation. This was the quiet before the catastrophe. The silence of the docks, the hum of the refrigerator, the lap of the water against the hull of a smuggler's boat. It is a moment of suspension, a breath held before the plunge. The world was awash in excess, and that excess was about to demand a terrible price. The emerald breath of the mountains had traveled a long way from the sacred valleys of the Incas, through the sterile labs of Germany, across the Atlantic to the salons of Paris, and finally, carried on the wings of greed, to the stovetops of America. The journey was almost complete. The transformation was absolute, and the darkness was about to descend. In the distance, beyond the horizon where the sea meets the sky, the clouds are gathering. They are dark and bruised, heavy with rain. But the storm that is coming is not made of water. It is made of smoke. White, dense, chemical smoke. And it will blow through the concrete canyons of the cities, through the playgrounds and the living rooms, leaving nothing untouched. The tide is coming in, and it will not recede for a very long time. Here is where the tragedy solidifies, quite literally, in the humble theater of the kitchen. We must leave behind the sweeping vistas of the Andes, the mahogany-paneled laboratories of Victorian Europe, and the sun-drenched airstrips of the Caribbean. The story now contracts, shrinking down from the global to the domestic, from the macro to the micro. It enters the most intimate space of human existence, the room where we break bread, where we sustain life, where the family gathers. It enters the kitchen. But in this chapter of history, the kitchen is not a place of nourishment. It is a place of transmutation. Picture, if you will, the setting. It is late at night. The city outside is a distant hum of traffic and sirens, a soundscape that never truly sleeps. But inside, in the dim light of a small apartment, there is a focused silence. The linoleum floor is worn. The refrigerator hums with a rhythmic, mechanical rattle. On the counter, there are no vegetables, no flour for bread, no milk for a child. Instead, there is a tableau of elements that seems innocent enough to the untrained eye, yet holds the potential for a catastrophic energy release. The recipe was deceptively simple, a mixture of elements that one might find in any home. It was this simplicity that made it so terrifyingly effective. There was no need for the complex centrifuges of the German chemists, nor the massive ether vats of the jungle cartels. The tools of this new trade were the tools of the housewife. A glass jar, a metal spoon, a box of baking soda, and a source of fire. It was a democratization of chemistry, a lowering of the barrier to entry that allowed the alchemist's power to be wielded by anyone with a stove. Let us look at the ingredients with the eye of a historian and a chemist. First, there is the water, the universal solvent, the ancient element that makes up the oceans and our own bodies. It is clear, cool, and neutral. It is the medium in which the transformation will take place, the amniotic fluid of the birth of the rock. Then, there is the second ingredient, sodium bicarbonate, baking soda. It is a humble powder, a staple of the American pantry for over a century. Its history is one of domestic comfort. In the 1840s, prospectors and pioneers carried it across the plains to make their biscuits rise. It is the agent of leavening, the breath within the bread, the substance that makes cakes light and airy. It is used to clean teeth, to scrub counters, to settle an upset stomach. It is the very essence of the benign. It is sold in a bright orange box, a symbol of wholesomeness. But here, in this darkened kitchen, it plays the role of the base. It is the chemical key that will unlock the shackles of the hydrochloride molecule. And finally, there is the third ingredient, the expensive white powder, the cocaine hydrochloride. It sits in a small plastic bag or a folded piece of paper. It has traveled thousands of miles to be here. It carries the memory of the high-altitude sun and the dark cargo hold. It is a salt, water-soluble, designed to dissolve in the blood. In this form, it is fragile. It fears the damp. It fears the wind. It is a luxury item, a dust of the elite. But it is about to shed its skin. The process begins. The alchemist, who is perhaps just a young man seeking a way out of poverty, or a user seeking a higher peak, pours the water into a glass jar or a Pyrex measuring cup. He adds the white powder. It dissolves, disappearing into the liquid, becoming invisible. Then, the baking soda is added. The ratio is debated, a folk science passed down in whispers, but the effect is the same. The water clouds. A sludge forms at the bottom. The elements are meeting, but they have not yet married. They need the fourth element. They need fire. Picture the blue flame of a gas stove flickering in the dim light of the apartment. It is a circle of small, sharp teeth of fire, hissing gently. The vessel is placed over the heat. This is the moment of activation. Heat is the great accelerator of the universe. It excites the molecules, making them dance, making them collide. As the mixture begins to warm, the magic of the reaction begins. It is not magic, of course. It is strict organic chemistry. But in the shadows of the night, it feels like a dark spell. As the mixture boils, a chemical dissociation occurs. We must pause to appreciate the violence of this microscopic event. The cocaine molecule, in its powder form, is attached to a hydrochloride molecule. This attachment makes it stable and soluble. But the heat and the baking soda attack this bond. It is a molecular divorce. The baking soda neutralizes the acid of the hydrochloride. It strips it away. It is a liberation of the base alkaloid. The spirit of the plant, which had been tamed and leashed by the German chemists of the 19th century, is being set free once again. The water begins to bubble, a rolling boil that agitates the solution. Steam rises like a ghost, curling up toward the ceiling, carrying with it the faint chemical scent of the reaction. This steam is the water evaporating, the medium leaving the stage. And as the water recedes, what is left behind begins to change. The cocaine alkaloid, no longer water-soluble, begins to separate. It turns into an oil. Watch closely in the eye of your mind. See the surface of the boiling water. Yellowish, oily blobs begin to form, coalescing like droplets of mercury. They swirl and dance, driven by the convection of the heat. They are the pure essence of the drug. They are the free base. They are gathering together, driven by a hydrophobic instinct, fleeing the water that surrounds them. It is a moment of liquid gold, a concentration of value that is mesmerizing to the beholder. The alchemist watches with bated breath. The timing is crucial. Too much heat and the oil will burn. Too little and the reaction will not complete. When the oil has fully separated, the heat is cut. The blue flame dies with a soft phut. The room returns to semi-darkness. Now comes the cooling. The jar is taken off the stove. Sometimes ice cubes are added to shock the mixture. Sometimes it is simply left to stand in the cool air. And here is where the state of matter shifts. The oil, as it cools, begins to seize. It does not turn back into a powder. It does not return to the soft, snow-like dust of the Gilded Age. It hardens, it solidifies, it crystallizes into a solid mass. The tragedy solidifies. The yellow oil turns into a hard, rock-like substance. It is off-white, sometimes beige, sometimes ivory. It looks organic, like a piece of coral or a rough gemstone. It has weight. It has density. It is no longer a salt. It is a stone. The alchemist reaches into the water, now cool, and pulls out the solid mass. He breaks it apart. As it breaks, as the internal structures fracture, it makes a sound. Snap. Crackle. It is a sharp, distinct sound, like the breaking of a dry twig or the crunch of a boot on gravel. This sound would give the substance its onomatopoeic name. Crack. It is a name that sounds like a breakage, like a fracture in the world. And indeed, that is what it was. These were small, off-white pebbles, durable and easy to transport. This was the birth of rock. Consider the physical properties of this new object. The powder was difficult to handle. It could blow away in a breeze. It dissolved in sweat. It required little glass vials and silver spoons. The rock, however, was robust. You could hold it in your hand. You could drop it on the floor and pick it up. It was impervious to moisture. It could be hidden in the cheek, in the shoe, in the crack of a pavement. It was the ultimate commodity for a rough environment. It was a marvel of dark efficiency, turning a high-priced luxury into single-serving units of intense potency. A single gram of powder, which might cost $100, could be cooked up and broken down into 10, maybe 20 rocks. Each rock could be sold for $5 or $10. Do you see the economic brilliance of this tragedy? It took a product that was exclusive to the rich and broke it down into micropayments that the poor could afford. It was the mass production of addiction. It was the Ford Model T of narcotics. In the silence of these kitchens, a new state of matter was created. It was an unholy stone, created not by geological pressure over eons, but by a chemical reaction over minutes. Think of the diamond, the ruby, the granite of the earth. These stones are born in the crushing depths of the planet, forged over millions of years by heat and pressure. They are symbols of eternity. The crack rock is the antithesis of this. It is the stone of the instant. It is born in 10 minutes on a stovetop. It offers an eternity of feeling that lasts only 5 minutes. It is a mockery of geological time. The alchemist dries the rocks on a paper towel. They sit there, innocuous, looking like gravel you might find in a fish tank. But they are radioactive with potential energy. They are ready to be sold. They are ready to be burned. And this is the crucial difference. The powder could not be smoked. The heat would destroy it. But the rock? The rock is born of heat, and it craves the heat. It has a lower melting point. When flame touches it, it does not burn, it vaporizes. It turns into a thick, white smoke that is ghostlier and deadlier than the steam that birthed it. This volatility was something the original leaf never possessed. The leaf on the bush in the Andes is a slow creature. It grows with the seasons. It offers its energy slowly over hours of chewing. The rock offers everything at once. It is a biological bomb. It carries with it a kinetic energy that demands release. As we stand in the kitchen, watching the rocks dry under the singular bulb of the ceiling light, we must feel the weight of this moment. This is the fulcrum. Before this, the drug was a problem. After this, it was a plague. The kitchen, the heart of the home, had been subverted. The baking soda, the heart of the bread, had been corrupted. The water, the source of life, had been used to birth a stone of death. The alchemist packs the rocks into small plastic vials, the tops snapped shut. The inventory is ready. The lab is closed. The stove is cold. But the heat has not dissipated. It has merely been transferred into the product. It is a potential energy waiting for a kinetic trigger. Outside, the city continues its nocturnal rhythm, but the streets are about to change. The rock is coming. It is small enough to fit in a pocket, cheap enough to be bought with loose change, and powerful enough to rewrite the neural pathways of the human brain in a single session. The kitchen alchemy is complete. The experiment is a success, and the result is a substance that will burn through the fabric of society just as easily as the flame burned under the pot. We leave the kitchen now, stepping backward into the shadows, leaving the alchemist to his work. The air smells of baking soda and ammonia. It is a smell that will become familiar in stairwells and hallways across the nation. It is the scent of the new era. the era of the rock, the era of the instant, the era of the crackle. The stone is made, the ghost is trapped in the rock, waiting for the fire to set it free again. And when it is set free, it will not rise like steam, it will strike like lightning. To understand the grip this substance held, to truly comprehend how a chemical compound could dismantle the infrastructure of a human soul, and, by extension, the infrastructure of a city, one must journey inward. We must leave the external world of street corners, kitchen stovetops, and international smuggling routes, and descend into the microscopic universe of the human body. We must look at the architecture of the lungs, the rushing river of the bloodstream, and the sacred, electric cathedral of the brain. It is here, in the silence of our own biology, that the true tragedy of the crack epidemic was written. It was not a war fought with guns, but a war fought with neurotransmitters, a siege laid against the very mechanisms of survival and pleasure. The story of this chapter begins with a small, unassuming object, the glass pipe. In the mid-1980s, these objects became the artifacts of a new era. They were often makeshift, crafted from the small glass tubes that held artificial roses, sold in convenience stores for pennies. These love roses, ostensibly romantic trinkets, were hollowed out, the synthetic flower discarded, leaving behind a clear, cylindrical vessel. Into one end, a filter was inserted, often a wad of coarse copper wool, scrubbed from a scouring pad known as chore boy. This copper mesh acted as a screen, a bed for the rock to rest upon. It was a crude chalice, a rough-hewn instrument of ingestion, but it was the telescope through which a generation would look into the abyss. To understand the grip, one must understand the physiology of the smoke. When the white powder of the previous era was consumed, it was typically insufflated, snorted into the nose. This is a slow, inefficient journey. The powder sits on the mucous membranes of the sinus cavity. It must dissolve. It must navigate the capillaries, struggling through the constriction of the blood vessels. It is a long, meandering walk to the brain, taking minutes to reach its peak. The user feels a gradual lift, a rising tide of energy. It is a gentle slope. But the rock is different. The rock is designed for fire. Picture the ritual in the quiet of a room. The lighter is struck. The flame is brought to the glass. The rock, resting on its bed of copper, does not burn in the traditional sense. It does not turn to ash like tobacco. It sublimates. It undergoes a rapid phase change, skipping the liquid state almost entirely in the intense heat, transforming from a solid stone into a thick, white, milky vapor. This is not smoke. It is the ghost of the alkaloid, freed from its earthly tether. It is a cloud of pure, concentrated chemical potential. The user inhales. The vapor travels down the trachea, a warm, chemical wind rushing into the bronchial tree. It moves deeper, past the bronchi, into the bronchioles, until it reaches the very edge of the respiratory system, the alveoli. These are the tiny, grape-like sacs where the miracle of breathing occurs. They are the interface between the air and the blood. If you were to unfold the surface area of the human lungs, flattening out every alveoli, it would cover the size of a tennis court. It is a massive, sprawling landscape of absorption. When the vapor hits this landscape, it does not hesitate. Unlike the nose, which is a guarded gate, the lungs are an open door. The surface area is vast, the membrane is vanishingly thin, and the blood supply is torrential. The vapor diffuses instantly across the membrane. In a fraction of a heartbeat, the drug has entered the oxygenated blood, the red river that flows directly from the lungs to the heart. This is the crucial difference. This is the mechanics of the lightning. The blood, now supercharged with the alkaloid, is pumped by the heart not to the body, but directly upward, through the carotid arteries, straight to the brain. There is no filtration by the liver. There is no delay. The journey from the lip of the pipe to the center of the mind takes approximately 8 to 10 seconds. It is faster than the speed of thought. It is a ballistic impact. The substance arrives at the blood-brain barrier, the fortress wall that protects the brain from toxins and foreign invaders. But the cocaine molecule is a master of disguise. It is lipophilic, fat-loving. It slips through the fatty sheath of the barrier like a phantom passing through a wall. It enters the sanctum of the central nervous system. Here, we must visualize the landscape of the brain not as a gray mass, but as a galaxy of neurons, billions of stars communicating with one another through flashes of chemical light. The space between these neurons is called the synapse. It is a tiny canyon, a gap that must be bridged for a thought, a feeling, or a movement to occur. The bridges are built by neurotransmitters, chemical messengers that swim across the gap to deliver a signal. The most important of these messengers, for our story, is dopamine. Dopamine is often misunderstood as merely the pleasure chemical. It is far more ancient and profound than that. Dopamine is the molecule of salience. It is the brain's way of saying, pay attention, this is important, this is vital for survival. It is the reward we get for eating when we are hungry, for drinking when we are thirsty, for procreating. It is the master switch of life, the carrot that nature dangles to keep us alive. Under normal circumstances, dopamine is released into the synapse, delivers its message of satisfaction to the receptor on the other side, and then is quickly recycled. It is vacuumed back up by transporters to be used again. It is a balanced, rhythmic cycle of release and reuptake, a gentle tide that ebbs and flows. But the rock changes the physics of this tide. The molecule of cocaine is shaped like a key that fits perfectly into the lock of the dopamine transporter. When the drug hits the brain in that lightning strike, it jams the vacuum. It blocks the reuptake pumps. It effectively barricades the doors, preventing the dopamine from leaving the synapse. But the brain, unaware of the blockade, continues to release dopamine. The level of the neurotransmitter begins to rise. It floods the canyon. It overflows the banks. It creates a tsunami of chemical signaling. The receptors on the receiving neuron are not just tickled. They are slammed open. They are forced to fire again and again, screaming a message of absolute, unadulterated importance. This is the rush. This is the bell ringer. The user, sitting in that dim room, experiences an immediate, overwhelming flood of sensation. It is often described as auditory ringing in the ears, a roar like a train passing through the head. It is a sensation of godlike euphoria. The constraints of the human body seem to dissolve. Fear, hunger, fatigue, shame, all the heavy luggage of mortal existence vanishes in an instant. It is a moment of absolute perfection. The brain is being told, chemically, that it has achieved the ultimate goal of evolution. It feels like solving a complex equation, like hitting the perfect note, like the moment of victory in a great battle, but magnified 1,000 times. It is a feeling of omnipotence. For a few seconds, the user is not a person struggling with poverty or trauma or loneliness. They are Zeus on Olympus. They are pure energy. But this brevity is the cruelty of the design. The brain is a self-regulating system. It seeks homeostasis, balance. It cannot sustain a lightning strike. The flood of dopamine is finite. The neurons, exhausted by the barrage, begin to shut down. The drug is metabolized quickly by the body, broken down by enzymes in the blood. The blockade on the transporters lifts. The dopamine is flushed away. The fall is as vertical as the ascent. The user is lifted to the peaks of Olympus and then dropped almost instantly back into the gray reality of the street. The high from smoked cocaine lasts only minutes, 5, perhaps 10 at the most. It is a fleeting moment of gold that dissolves into ash, and the place where the user lands is not where they started. They land lower. The brain, having adjusted to the flood, is now in a state of drought. The natural levels of dopamine are depleted. The receptors, having been overstimulated, have retreated, becoming less sensitive. This is a phenomenon known as down-regulation. The silence that follows the roar is not peaceful, it is deafening. It is a chasm of longing that is physically painful. This is the state of dysphoria. It is the opposite of euphoria. It is a profound, crushing inability to feel pleasure. The world appears drained of color. The things that normally bring joy, a meal, a smile, a sunset, feel hollow and gray. The brain, tricked into believing this smoke is as vital as food or air, screams for its return. It perceives the absence of the drug not as a disappointment, but as a survival emergency. It rewrites the hierarchy of human needs. In the ancient reptilian parts of the brain, the basal ganglia, the amygdala, a new code is written. The drug is placed at the very top of the pyramid. It is more important than sleep. It is more important than safety. It is more important than the love of a child or the respect of a community. The logic centers of the prefrontal cortex, the parts of the brain responsible for planning and morality, are bypassed. The pilot is locked out of the cockpit, and the autopilot of addiction takes over. In the quiet of the night, you can imagine the tragedy of this cycle. Picture the user, the pipe still warm in their hand, the vapor still lingering in the air. The feeling is already gone. The memory of the feeling is vivid, taunting them. The reality of the room returns. The peeling paint, the empty fridge, the sirens outside. The contrast is unbearable. The only way to escape the pain of the drop is to take another hit. And so, the chase begins. It is a chase for a feeling that is forever retreating. This is the law of diminishing returns written in neurochemistry. The second hit is never as good as the first. The third is weaker than the second. The brain is exhausted, the dopamine stores are running low. But the hunger does not fade. It grows. It becomes a Jones, a physical itch in the center of the soul that cannot be scratched. It was a biological trap, sprung upon a generation that had no defense against such rapid neurological warfare. The indigenous people of the Andes had chewed the leaf for millennia without this result, because the leaf was a gentle conversation with the body. The powder of the Victorian age was a loud argument. But the rock? The rock was a scream. The human brain, evolved over millions of years to forage and hunt on the savanna, was simply not built to withstand this kind of hyperstimulation. It was a hacking of the operating system. We must look at this not with judgment, but with a clinical and compassionate eye. The behavior that followed, the desperation, the theft, the neglect, was the result of a hijacked survival instinct. When a man is drowning, he will climb over his own brother to reach the surface. The drug created a sensation of drowning every time the high wore off. The crackhead wandering the streets was not a monster. He was a human being in the grip of a chemical starvation that the rest of the world could not see. The lightning in the lungs left scars that were invisible but profound. It altered the microstructures of the brain. It pruned the dendritic spines of the neurons, changing the way the mind processed decision-making and impulse control. It created a hypofrontality, a weakening of the brakes in the brain. Even when the user wanted to stop, even when they wept with the desire to be free, the machinery of their own mind was working against them. The stop button had been disconnected. As the 1980s progressed, this cycle of peak and valley, of lightning and darkness, was repeated millions of times in millions of rooms. It became the rhythm of the city. The frantic energy of the user seeking the next blast was the engine that drove the crime waves and the violence. It was a hunger that ate the furniture, the jewelry, the cars, and eventually the very structure of the family. But in the moment of the hit, in that 10 seconds of transit from the lungs to the brain, there was no crime, no poverty, no pain. There was only the flash. And for a population living in the shadows of the American dream, in neighborhoods where hope was a scarce commodity, that flash was a powerful, terrible seducer. It offered a momentary exit from a world that felt like a prison. It was a false door, a trapdoor that opened only downward. But for a few glorious seconds, it felt like flight. We leave this chapter in the silence of the synapse, in the gap between the neurons where the tragedy unfolded. The pipe is cold. The rock is gone. The brain sits in the dark, waiting, trembling, demanding the lightning to strike again. And outside, The sun is rising on a city that is about to wake up to the wreckage left by the storm. The biological trap has snapped shut, and the key has been thrown away into the smoke. As the calendar turned the page from the first half of the decade to the mid-1980s, the atmosphere of the American city began to undergo a profound metamorphosis. It was not a sudden shift, like the flipping of a switch, but rather a slow, creeping alteration of the light, a deepening of the shadows, and a chilling of the communal air. The cities of America, the great, sprawling leviathans of concrete and steel, began to change visually and spiritually. The rocks traveled from the enclosed intimacy of the kitchens, where the alchemy had taken place, out into the open air of the corners, fracturing the social contract of neighborhoods that had stood for generations. To understand this era, one must first visualize the lighting. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, many American cities had replaced their old, silver-white mercury vapor streetlights with high-pressure sodium lamps. These new lights were efficient, cost-effective, and they bathed the streets in a distinct, pervasive amber glow. It was a sickly, jaundiced light, an artificial peach-colored haze that stripped the color from the trees and the cars, rendering the nocturnal world in a monochrome of orange and black. Picture the great metropolises, New York, Los Angeles, Miami, under this amber glow. It created a theatrical stage for the tragedy that was about to unfold, a chiaroscuro world where the shadows were deep and the illuminated spaces felt exposed and dangerous. The drug did not discriminate in its chemical hunger. The receptors in the brain of a stockbroker are identical to the receptors in the brain of a factory worker. However, like water seeking the lowest point in the topography, the heavy sediment of the trade settled in communities that were already fractured by neglect. We must remember that the ground had been prepared long before the first rock was cooked. The deindustrialization of the urban centers, the flight of the middle class to the suburbs, and the policy of benign neglect had left vast swaths of the inner city vulnerable. The factories were closed, the windows broken, the jobs gone. The tinder was dry, stacked high by the winds of economic change, waiting for a spark. The rock was that spark. It hollowed out the infrastructure of daily life, eating away at the soft tissue of the community. Consider the stoop. In the architecture of the row house and the brownstone, the front steps, the stoop, were a sacred space. This was the intermediate zone between the private sanctuary of the home and the public theater of the street. For decades, the stoop was the parliament of the neighborhood. It was where the grandmothers sat on folding chairs to watch the children play stickball. It was where the men played dominoes and discussed politics. It was the eyes and ears of the block, a self-regulating system of safety and connection. But as the rock arrived, the ecology of the stoop changed. The conversation silenced. The grandmothers retreated behind locked doors. The stoop became a marketplace of desperation, a spot where the transaction of the $10 rock took precedence over the social exchange of news and goodwill. The lookouts, often young boys recruited by the dealers, took up their posts. The rhythm of the block shifted from the slow, steady beat of family life to the frantic staccato pulse of the trade. The eyes on the street were replaced by the watchers on the corner, and the difference in intent changed the very air of the neighborhood. The visual landscape shifted in response to this new economy. The architecture of fear began to rise. Windows that once held flower boxes were now boarded up with plywood, the grain of the wood weathering to a silvery gray. The skeletons of burned-out buildings stood as monuments to the chaos. In the Bronx, in Detroit, in parts of Chicago, entire blocks began to resemble the ruins of post-war Europe. Landlords, unable to collect rent or unwilling to maintain properties in the war zone, walked away. The buildings were stripped of their copper piping, their fixtures, their very bones, until only the brick shells remained, staring out with empty sockets at the street below. These ruins became the shooting galleries, the base houses, the cavernous dens where time stopped and the pipe ruled. This was the era of the epidemic. The word itself is medical. implying a sickness that spreads through contact, a plague that moves through the air. And indeed, it felt like a contagion. It was a time of fear, where the trust between neighbors evaporated like the smoke itself. In a healthy community, the neighbor is a potential ally, a source of sugar in a pinch, a watcher of one's children. In the shadow of the rock, the neighbor became a potential threat. Was the boy next door a lookout? Was the man across the hall a user who might break in to steal a television? Was the car slowing down at the curb a drive-by shooter or a customer? The paranoia that the drug induced in the individual user began to manifest in the collective psyche of the city. Iron bars appeared on windows, first on the ground floor, then climbing higher, story by story, until the apartment buildings looked like vertical prisons. The bodegas and corner stores, the lifelines of the urban food desert, installed thick, bulletproof plexiglass partitions. The transaction of buying a quart of milk or a loaf of bread now took place through a spinning, lazy Susan drawer, a physical barrier that said, "I do not trust you, and you should not trust me." The human touch was removed from the commerce of daily life. The media painted pictures of war zones, sending reporters in flak jackets to stand on the corners of 8th Avenue or South Central. Time and Newsweek printed covers with bold, terrifying fonts. Paradise Lost, The Crack Plague, Kids Who Kill. They showed grainy images of arrests, of vials on the pavement, of young men in handcuffs. They told a story of super predators and crack babies, creating a mythology of monsters. But beneath the sensationalism, beneath the headlines that were designed to sell magazines to the fearful suburbs, was a profound human sorrow that the cameras rarely captured. The cameras showed the violence, but they missed the silence. They missed the empty chair at the dinner table. Families were dissolved, not by a decree of law, but by the solvent of addiction. The rock had a unique ability to override the maternal and paternal instincts. In the animal kingdom, the drive to protect the young is the strongest force in nature. But the dopamine flood of the drug was stronger. Mothers and fathers were lost to the siren song of the pipe, leaving a generation of children to navigate a world where the adults were present in body but absent in spirit. Picture a living room in 1986. The television is on, casting a blue light. The children are there, perhaps doing homework, perhaps waiting for dinner. The parent is in the other room, behind a closed door. The smell of the burning rock, that distinctive chemical plastic scent, seeps under the door frame. The children know what it means. They learn to be quiet. They learn to cook for themselves. They learn that the person who comes out of that room is not the same person who went in. This was the latchkey generation, but the term is too gentle. These were the orphans of the living, children who had to become their own parents, their own guardians. The burden of care often skipped a generation, landing squarely on the shoulders of the grandmothers. The big mamas, the abuelas, the matriarchs who had thought their child-rearing days were over, stepped into the breach. They took in the grandchildren, stretching their pensions and their patience to hold the family together. They were the levees that held back the flood. In the churches on Sunday mornings, the pews were filled with these women and their grandchildren, a demographic gap visible to the naked eye. The missing generation of the parents, lost to the streets or to the prison system. The city, once a vibrant organism of connection, became a labyrinth of isolation. In the great theory of urbanism, the city is a place of serendipity, where strangers meet and ideas collide. But in the crack era, the city became a place of avoidance. Eye contact was dangerous. To look at someone too long was a challenge. To walk down the wrong street was a death sentence. The geography of the city was redrawn, not by city planners, but by gangs and territories. Invisible lines were painted across the asphalt. This is Crip territory. This is Blood territory. This is the Latin Kings. To cross these lines was to enter a foreign and hostile nation. The soundscape of the city changed as well. The ambient noise of the metropolis, the traffic, the distant hum of industry, was punctuated by the staccato beat of crisis. The siren became the anthem of the night. The wail of the ambulance, the chirp of the police cruiser, the roar of the fire engine responding to another tenement blaze. And beneath these loud alarms, there were the smaller, sharper sounds. The breaking of auto glass, the shouting of an argument, the popping of gunfire that was often mistaken for firecrackers, until the silence that followed stretched too long. Let us look specifically at the visual transformation of New York City, the epicenter of the media's gaze. In the mid-'80s, the subway system became a rolling museum of the crisis. The trains were covered, inside and out, with graffiti, top to bottoms, that screamed for recognition in a world that had turned its back. But inside the cars, the mood was tense. The conductors of the crack trade moved between the cars. The homeless population exploded as the drugs stripped people of their housing and their dignity. The stations were dim, smelling of ozone and urine, places of transit to be navigated with head down and pace quickened. Above ground, Times Square was not the Disney-fied plaza of the future. It was a gritty, neon-soaked corridor of peep shows and hustlers, where the rock was sold openly under the marquees of old theaters. In Los Angeles, the devastation looked different. It was horizontal rather than vertical. The palm trees stood in silhouette against the smoggy sunsets, bearing witness to a war that was fought from moving vehicles. The crack house in LA might be a small bungalow with a manicured lawn that had gone to seed, the windows barred, the driveway filled with cars that never moved. The sheer scale of the city meant that the isolation was even more profound. A scream in South Central could be swallowed by the vastness of the grid, unheard by the hills of Hollywood. The freeways became the arteries of distribution, carrying the rock from the ports to the inland empire, spreading the shadow like an ink stain across the map. In Miami, the vibe was tropical Gothic. The money was louder, the violence more explosive. The cocaine cowboys era of the early '80s, with its machine gun battles in shopping malls, had given way to a grimier, more desperate street war. The neon of South Beach reflected on the water, but a few miles away in Liberty City, or Overtown, the streetlights flickered over scenes of profound destitution. The contrast was blinding. The drug that fueled the parties of the supermodels was destroying the nervous systems of the poor just across the causeway. This period also saw the rise of a new kind of ruin, the trap house. This was not merely a place where drugs were sold, it was a new kind of social institution, a dark mirror of the community center. In the trap house, time did not exist. There were no clocks. The windows were covered with heavy blankets to block out the sun, for the sun brings judgment and the reality of the day. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and sweat. It was a place of pure consumption, a black hole that sucked in resources, money, jewelry, electronics, bodies, and emitted nothing but smoke. The tragedy of the trap house was that it was often a home that had been hijacked. A grandmother's house, a family apartment, slowly taken over by the addiction of a relative, until the furniture was sold, the lights were cut, and the structure itself became a vessel for the trade. As the epidemic deepened, the public space of the city, the parks and playgrounds, began to empty. The swing sets rusted. The basketball courts, once the proving grounds for neighborhood glory, became the offices of the dealers. The grass grew long. The commons, the shared green spaces that were meant to be the lungs of the city, became no-go zones. Parents forbade their children to play outside. The radius of a child's world shrank from the neighborhood to the block, to the front yard, and finally to the living room. The generation that grew up in this era suffered from a spatial confinement, a claustrophobia born of necessity. And yet, amidst this desolation, there were flickering candles of resilience. We must not paint the canvas entirely black. There were the teachers who stayed late to keep the school doors open, creating safe havens. There were the church deacons who organized neighborhood watches, walking the streets with flashlights and walkie-talkies, unarmed men and women standing against the tide. There were the mothers who fought physically to drag their sons and daughters out of the crack houses. This resistance was quiet, untelevised, and heroic. It was the antibody response of the community trying to fight off the infection. But the weight of the shadow was immense. The psychological toll of living in a high-crime area, a clinical term for a war zone, altered the cortisol levels of an entire demographic. To live in a state of hypervigilance, always listening for the footstep, always scanning the perimeter, is to live in a state of chronic stress. It wears down the heart. It shortens the telomeres of the DNA. The concrete garden was not just visually blighted, it was biologically toxic. The environment itself, reshaped by the economics of the rock, became a health hazard. The media narrative of the super predator, the idea that a generation of soulless, violent youth was rising from the ghettos, was a cruel distortion. What was rising was a generation of traumatized survivors. The young men standing on the corners, hard-faced and armed, were often the same children who had watched their families dissolve, who had been left to fend for themselves in an economy that had no place for them. The violence was not born of inherent evil. It was born of a desperate competition for scarce resources in a lawless microcosm. The rock had destroyed the economy of legitimate work and replaced it with an economy of predatory capitalism, where the only way to rise was to be ruthless. By the end of the 1980s, the American city was a different beast than it had been at the start of the decade. It was harder, colder, more fortified. The optimism of the civil rights era, the belief in the Great Society, had been battered by the reality of the crack pipe. The social contract, the unwritten agreement that said, "We are all in this together," had been burned. The suburbs looked at the cities with fear and loathing, building higher walls and voting for tougher laws. The cities looked at themselves with grief. The amber glow of the streetlights buzzed on, night after night, illuminating the boarded windows and the empty stoops. The smoke drifted up from the alleyways, joining the smog of the exhaust, hanging like a shroud over the skyline. The concrete garden had not died, for cities are resilient things, but it had wilted. It had grown thorns. It had learned to survive with less light and less water. The shadows had lengthened, and in those shadows, millions of stories were being written. Stories of loss, of endurance, and of a hunger that could not be fed. As we move through the night of this history, we must acknowledge the depth of this valley. The epidemic was not just a statistic, it was a season of the soul. It was a time when the very concept of home was under siege. The rock had turned the key in the lock, and the door had swung open to a darkness that would take decades to dispel. The rhythm of the city had changed, and the melody was a blues song, played in a minor key, echoing off the brick walls of a nation in pain. To understand the next phase of this tragedy, we must leave the chaotic, amber-lit streets of the city and enter the cool, echoing halls of the state. We must trade the smell of burning chemicals for the scent of old paper, polished mahogany, and marble. It is 1986. The summer air in Washington, D.C. humid, heavy with the static of an approaching storm. But this storm is not meteorological. It is political. The smoke that had risen from the glass pipes in the trap houses had finally drifted into the corridors of power, and the reaction it provoked would shape the destiny of millions. In the history of nations, there are moments when fear overtakes reason, when the desire for order crushes the nuance of justice. This was one of those moments. The media had painted a picture of a nation under siege. The death of a promising young basketball star, Len Bias, just days after being drafted to the Boston Celtics, acted as a catalyst, a singular, tragic event that galvanized the public panic. Though his death was caused by the powder, not the rock, the distinction was lost in the fury of the moment. The narrative was simple, terrifying, and total. The drug was a monster, and the monster had to be slain. In response to the smoke and the sorrow, the state raised its hand, not with healing, but with iron. The legislative machinery, usually a slow and grinding apparatus of debate and compromise, began to spin with a frantic, feverish speed. The lawmakers, driven by the looming elections and the terrified cries of their constituents, sought a weapon. They did not reach for the scalpel of public health intervention. They reached for the hammer of incarceration. They crafted the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, a document that would become the scripture of the new era. A great disparity was written into the books, a mathematical cruelty that defies the logic of science. The chemists knew that cocaine hydrochloride, the powder, and cocaine base, the rock, were the same active ingredient. One was simply the other, freed from a salt. It was the same molecule, the same dopamine reuptake inhibitor, the same poison, and the same pleasure. But the law decided that they were different species entirely. The law decided that the smoke was 100 times more evil than the dust. This is the infamous 100-to-1 ratio. It is a number that should be etched into the tombstone of the era. The legislation dictated that possessing 5 grams of crack cocaine, the weight of a few sugar packets, enough for a weekend of use, would carry the same mandatory minimum sentence as possessing 500 grams of powder cocaine, a brick of drugs, a dealer's weight. 5 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for a handful of pebbles. To trigger the same penalty with the powder, one would need a briefcase full of the substance. The intent was to target the kingpins, the violent distributors, but the result was a dragnet that caught the minnows and let the sharks swim free. The powder was the drug of the wealthy, the suburban, the connected. The rock was the drug of the poor, the urban, the marginalized. Without explicitly naming race or class, the law created a 2-tiered system of justice that mapped perfectly onto the fractured geography of the American city. It was a legal alchemy as potent as the kitchen chemistry. It turned a public health crisis into a crime against the state. Picture the courtrooms of this era. These are the theaters where the script was performed. High ceilings, wooden pews, the American flag standing still in the corner. The air is conditioned, cold, contrasting with the heat of the streets outside. The soundscape is distinct. The rustle of files, the murmur of the stenographer's machine, and the heavy, final sound of the gavel striking wood. That sound thud-echoed like thunder rolling across a valley, signaling the end of a life's freedom. The judges, the arbiters of wisdom, found their hands tied by the new mandatory minimums. These laws stripped the judiciary of its discretion. It did not matter if the defendant was a first-time offender, a young mother, or a low-level lookout. It did not matter if they were an addict needing help rather than a criminal needing punishment. The law was a machine, a rigid algorithm. If the weight of the rock was 5 grams, the sentence was 5 years. If it was 50 grams, the sentence was 10 years. The gavel fell with the rhythmic, mechanical precision of a factory stamp. Thousands of souls were swept up in this dragnet. It was a great harvesting of humanity. The police tactics changed to match the ferocity of the law. The war on drugs was not just a slogan. It was a martial metaphor that turned citizens into combatants and neighborhoods into battlefields. The police department acquired armored personnel carriers, battering rams, and SWAT gear. The raid became the standard unit of engagement. Doors were smashed in the middle of the night. Flashbang grenades were thrown. The distinction between policing and occupying began to blur. And where did these thousands go? They were removed from the flow of time. They were taken from the concrete canyons of the city and transported to the rural hinterlands, where a new industry was booming. The prisons swelled, becoming cities within cities. In the late 1980s and into the 90s, the construction of correctional facilities became one of the few growth industries in America. Vast complexes of concrete and steel rose from the cornfields and the deserts, surrounded by razor wire that glistened in the sun like silver thorns. This was the carceral archipelago, a network of islands where the unwanted were exiled. These prisons were designed for containment, not rehabilitation. The philosophy of the era had shifted away from the idea that a man could be fixed. The prevailing theory was incapacitation. If you lock a man in a box, he cannot commit a crime. It was a brutal, binary logic. The library programs, the job training, the therapy sessions, these were slashed in budget cuts, viewed as coddling the enemy. The prison became a warehouse for human bodies. Imagine the sensory experience of the cell. It is a space measuring 6 feet by 8 feet. The walls are cinder block, painted a thick, glossy industrial white or pale green. The light comes from a fluorescent tube that buzzes with a low, headache-inducing hum. The door is solid steel with a small rectangular window of reinforced glass. The furniture is bolted to the floor. The bed is a steel slab with a thin mattress. The toilet is stainless steel. Everything is hard. Everything is cold. There are no soft surfaces, no warm colors, no silence. The sound of a prison is a constant cacophony of echoing voices, clanging metal and jingling keys. It is a place where privacy is extinct. A man in this box is stripped of his autonomy. He is told when to wake, when to eat, when to shower, when to sleep. He is given a number that replaces his name. He wears a uniform of orange or khaki that marks him as property of the state. He is suspended in a state of civil death. He loses the right to vote, the right to serve on a jury, and often the ability to secure a loan or a job upon his release. The tragedy lies in the silence of those cells, the years lost, the potential unfulfilled. A 5-year sentence is not just a pause, it is a rupture. It is 5 years of missed birthdays, missed funerals, missed graduations. It is a gap in the resume that can never be explained away. It is a severance of the bond between father and child, husband and wife. The war on drugs did not just punish the individual, it punished the lineage. The visitation room became the only point of contact between these two worlds. Picture the scene, a plexiglass barrier, thick and scratched, dividing the room. On one side, the father in his jumpsuit, on the other, the child held up by the grandmother. They speak through a telephone handset. They touch palms against the glass, but they cannot feel the warmth of the skin. The glass is cold. The conversation is monitored. The time is limited. 10 minutes remaining, the guard announces. And then, time's up. The connection is broken. The father goes back to the cell. The child goes back to the empty house. This cycle repeated itself hundreds of thousands of times. The prisons filled to capacity and then overflowed. Gymnasiums were converted into dormitories, with bunks stacked 3 high. The courts were clogged. The public defenders were overwhelmed, carrying caseloads so heavy that justice became a plea bargain, a quick signature on a piece of paper to avoid the risk of a trial. The system was eating itself. The irony, tragic and profound, was that this iron fist did little to stop the flow of the drug. The laws of economics are stubborn things. As long as the demand existed, that hunger in the brain for the lightning strike, the supply would find a way. When one dealer was arrested, another stepped up to take his place on the corner, drawn by the allure of the money and the lack of other options. The prison did not end the trade. It merely became a part of the trade's life cycle, a rite of passage, a gladiator school where young men went in as amateurs and came out as hardened professionals. The state had tried to crush a public health crisis with the blunt force of incarceration. It was like trying to perform surgery with a sledgehammer. The addiction was a disease of the brain, a rewiring of the dopamine pathways. It required treatment, therapy, and social support. Instead, it was met with handcuffs, cages, and a permanent criminal record. The war was fought against the symptoms, not the cause. As the years ground on, the demographics of the prison population shifted radically. The face of the prisoner became overwhelmingly young, male, and minority. The correctional system became a mechanism for managing the poor. It created a caste of untouchables, men who, even after serving their time, carried the felony label like a brand on their forehead. They were barred from public housing, barred from student loans, barred from voting. They were free in body but shackled in law. And the cost, the financial cost, was staggering. Billions of dollars were poured into the construction and maintenance of these facilities, money that could have gone to schools, to hospitals, to addiction treatment centers, was instead poured into concrete and razor wire. The prison industrial complex became a hungry beast that needed to be fed. Rural towns, decimated by the loss of manufacturing and agriculture, lobbied for prisons to be built in their backyards, viewing the incarceration of urban men as a form of economic development. Beds for heads became the grim calculus of rural survival. We look back at this chapter now with the clarity of hindsight, and we see the magnitude of the error. We see the collateral consequences that rippled out for generations. We see the fatherless homes, the distrust of authority, the deep, abiding anger of communities that felt occupied rather than protected. The gavel struck the wood, and the sound echoed, but it did not bring order. It brought a different kind of chaos, a slow-motion catastrophe of wasted lives. The iron of the state was strong, but it was brittle. It could break a man, but it could not heal him. It could lock a door, but it could not unlock the grip of the chemical. And so, the prisons stood as monuments to a failed philosophy, silent fortresses of sorrow scattered across the landscape. Inside, the men aged, the hair turned gray, the muscles softened. They sat on their bunks, staring at the painted block walls, counting the days, while outside, the seasons changed, the children grew up, and the world moved on without them. The war on drugs had no victory parade, only a long, mournful procession of the vanquished, marching in single file down the corridors of the Iron Archipelago. As night falls over the prison yard, the floodlights hum to life, casting long, sharp shadows. The towers are watched by guards who are also doing time, in their own way. The silence is heavy, filled with the breathing of thousands of men sleeping in close quarters. It is a sleep without rest, a waiting without end. The gavel has fallen, and the echo remains, vibrating in the bones of the nation, a testament to the time when we chose the cage over the cure. The wheel of time is a heavy millstone, grinding slowly but exceedingly fine, turning the sharp edges of the present into the smooth dust of the past. We have traveled a great distance together in this narrative, moving from the pristine, thin air of the Andean Cordilleras, through the mahogany-paneled laboratories of Europe, across the moonlit waters of the Caribbean, and into the fire-lit kitchens of the American city. We have witnessed the alchemy of the leaf, the hubris of the chemist, the greed of the smuggler, and the suffering of the user. But now, the calendar pages have turned thousands of times. The frantic energy of the 1980s and the grim desperation of the 1990s have receded into the history books. We stand now in the quiet of the present, looking back at the shoreline of that era as one looks at a storm that has finally passed, leaving altered landscapes in its wake. The smoke has largely cleared. The physical clouds of vaporized alkaloid that once hung heavy in the stairwells and the alleyways have dissipated, carried away by the winds of change. The distinct, acrid scent of the burning rock, that chemical perfume of baking soda and cocaine, base no longer defines the olfactory landscape of the inner city. It has been replaced by the scents of the modern age, the exhaust of hybrid cars, the roasting coffee of gentrified cafes, the digital ozone of a world constantly connected. But memory has a scent of its own, a phantom smell that lingers in the cultural consciousness long after the source has been extinguished. The scent of burning remains in the collective memory of the nation, a sensory echo of a time when the cities were on fire. As the city sleeps tonight, under a sky that is perhaps less amber and more LED white, we must walk through these streets with the eyes of a historian and the heart of a mourner. The panic has subsided. The headlines no longer scream about the crack epidemic or the super predators. The media gaze has shifted to new crises, new wars, new anxieties. But if you look closely at the asphalt, if you run your hand along the brickwork of the older buildings, you can still feel the heat of the fire that burned here. The scars on the cities remain, not always as open wounds, but as keloids-thick, toughened tissue that marks where the skin was broken. Consider the geography of the neighborhood. In many cities, there are empty lots where houses once stood, These are the missing teeth in the smile of the street. They are gaps in the urban fabric, now overgrown with weeds, or perhaps turned into community gardens or fenced off with chain link. These lots are silent monuments. They mark the places where the trap houses stood, where the fires claimed the structures, or where the city demolished the blight in a desperate attempt to cauterize the infection. To the casual passerby, it is just a vacant space, but to the elder who has lived on the block for 40 years, that empty lot is a volume of history. It is where the Jones family lived before the sun got hooked. It is where the raid happened in '88. It is where the ambulance came and never left. The emptiness is heavy with ghosts. And then there are the human scars, the living monuments to the era. We must speak of the lost generation not as a concept, but as a reality of flesh and blood. There are grandfathers walking these streets today who were absent for the childhoods of their sons. They are the men who were swept up in the dragnet of the war on drugs, the men who spent the prime of their lives in the concrete boxes of the carceral archipelago. They have returned now, gray-haired, moving a little slower, carrying the weight of the time served in the stoop of their shoulders. Picture a reunion on a front porch. The father, now 60, sits across from his son, now 35. There is a silence between them that is difficult to bridge. The father was gone for 15 years, locked away for the possession of a few rocks. The son grew up visiting a glass partition, hearing a voice through a telephone. Now they are free, but they are strangers. The father tries to offer wisdom, but his authority was eroded by his absence. The son tries to offer forgiveness, but the anger of the abandoned child is a hard knot to untie. This is the echo in the living room. The drug is gone, but the distance it created remains. The social gravity of the family was disrupted, and the planets are still wobbling in their orbits, trying to find a stable path. It is a tragedy of interrupted lineages. The wisdom that should have been passed down from father to son, how to shave, how to tie a tie, how to control one's temper, how to love a woman, was intercepted by the prison wall. The chain of knowledge was broken. And so the generation that grew up in the shadow of the rock had to invent their own manhood, often constructing it from the jagged pieces of street culture and survival instinct. The code of the streets became the surrogate father, a harsh disciplinarian that taught violence as a language of respect. We are still untangling this knot today. We are still trying to translate that language back into one of community and vulnerability. The story of crack cocaine is a lesson in unintended consequences, a tragic epic of how a plant from the Andes was twisted into a tool of devastation. It forces us to reflect on the nature of our relationship with the natural world. In the high mountains, the coca plant still grows. The wind still rustles through the leaves on the terrace farms of Bolivia and Peru. The indigenous people still chew the leaf with lime, offering a prayer to the earth. The plant itself was never evil. It was simply a plant, a collection of cells and chlorophyll. It was the emerald breath, a gift of stamina. But when that breath was captured, concentrated, and commodified by the mechanisms of modern greed, it became a hurricane. It teaches us that nature, when stripped of its context and its spirit, can become volatile. It teaches us that the purity sought by the Western chemist, the isolation of the active ingredient, is often a dangerous pursuit. The buffer of the leaf, the fiber, the ritual, the slow absorption, these were the safeguards designed by evolution and culture. By removing them, we created a monster. The rock was the ultimate expression of a society obsessed with the instant, the potent, and the profitable, regardless of the human cost. And yet, the furious chemistry has not disappeared. It has merely shape-shifted. The furious chemistry has been replaced by new synthetic ghosts. As the crack epidemic waned, a new tide began to rise, this time not from the jungles of South America, but from the pharmaceutical factories of the Midwest and the laboratories of the East. The opioid crisis, the fentanyl wave, these are the spiritual successors to the crack era. They are different chemically, depressants rather than stimulants, but they feed the same hunger. They fill the same void in the human soul. They exploit the same vulnerability in the dopamine pathways. There is a tragic irony in this succession. The crack epidemic was criminalized, treated with iron and scorn because it was associated with the poor and the black. The opioid crisis, affecting vast swaths of white, rural America, was initially treated with more compassion, viewed as a medical tragedy. But the mechanism of destruction is the same. The brain, hijacked by a molecule, destroying the life around it to feed the receptor. The ghost has changed its sheet, but the haunting is the same. It is a reminder that the drug problem is not about the substance, it is about the pain. It is about the human need to escape reality when reality becomes unbearable. As long as there is despair, there will be a market for the lightning, whether it comes in a rock, a pill, or a powder. But let us not linger only in the darkness. For every shadow, there must be a light source. As the city sleeps tonight, reflect on the resilience of the communities that survived the fire. Resilience is a word often used, but let us weigh it carefully. It is not just the ability to bounce back, it is the ability to grow around the scar. It is the tree that is struck by lightning, split down the middle, yet continues to put forth green leaves every spring. The streets are quieter now. The open-air markets that turned neighborhoods into war zones are largely gone. In their place, we see the slow, steady work of reconstruction. We see the grandmother who raised 3 generations sitting on her porch, her eyes clear, watching her great-grandchildren play in a park that she fought to reclaim from the dealers. She is a veteran of a domestic war, decorated with the invisible medals of endurance. She held the family together when the world was falling apart. She is the anchor. We see the former users, the men and women who walked through the fire and came out the other side. They are the old heads, the counselors, the ones who stand on the corners now not to sell, but to warn. They carry the history in their bodies. They have the raspy voices, the missing teeth, the weathered skin, but they also have a profound, hard-won wisdom. They are the keepers of the lore. They tell the young ones, "You don't want to go where I went. You don't want to see what I saw." They are the living antibodies of the community, using their own experience to inoculate the future. The healing is slow, like moss growing over a fallen stone. It is organic. It cannot be rushed. You cannot legislate trauma away. You cannot build a prison to hold grief. The healing happens in the quiet moments. It happens in the church basements where Narcotics Anonymous meetings are held, where men weep openly and are held by their brothers. It happens in the barber shops, where the talk has shifted from "who got shot" to "who got a job." It happens in the community gardens, where collard greens and tomatoes are planted in the soil that was once littered with vials. The act of planting a seed in that ground is an act of defiance. It is a declaration that life is stronger than the rock. We remember the lost, not as statistics, but as people caught in a chemical reaction that was bigger than themselves. The official numbers, the thousands of homicides, the millions of arrests, are cold and flat. They do not capture the texture of the loss. We must remember the musician whose melody was silenced by the pipe, the athlete whose legs were stilled, the mother whose lullaby was forgotten. They were not addicts or criminals first. They were human beings with dreams, with fears, with favorite colors and favorite foods. They were swept away by a flood they did not predict and could not swim against. History is a river that flows on, washing away the debris, but the shape of the riverbed is forever changed by the flood. The water is clearer now, the current is less violent, but the canyon through which it flows has been carved deeper. The trust in the police, the trust in the government, the trust in the medical system, these were eroded by the floodwaters, and the banks are steep and slippery. It will take generations to rebuild the bridges that were washed away. The legal system, too, is slowly waking from its fever dream. The draconian laws of the 1980s are being revisited. The disparity between the powder and the rock has been reduced, though not eliminated. There is talk of restorative justice, of expungement, of treating addiction as a health issue rather than a moral failing. It is a slow turning of the ship, a cumbersome maneuver for a vessel as large as the state, but the course is correcting. We are learning that the iron hand crushes, but the open hand heals. As we move toward the end of our story, let us widen our aperture one last time. Let us look at the city from high above, as if we are drifting in the basket of a balloon, silent and weightless. Below us, the grid of lights stretches out to the horizon. We see the arteries of the highways, the pulse of the traffic, the clusters of neighborhoods. We see the dark patches of the parks and the bright clusters of the downtowns. It is a beautiful, complex, breathing organism. It has survived. The city has metabolized the poison. It has scarred over. It has incorporated the tragedy into its DNA and continued to grow. This is the miracle of human society. We are fragile, yes. We are susceptible to the seduction of the chemical, to the lightning in the lungs. But we are also incredibly tough. We are like the dandelion that breaks through the concrete. We find a way to reach the sun. The story of crack cocaine is a dark chapter, a heavy volume in the library of our history. It is a story of shadows, but shadows only exist where there is light. The darkness of the era revealed the brightness of the spirits that withstood it. It revealed the depth of a mother's love, the strength of a neighbor's bond, the endurance of the human will. So, as the book closes, let us lower our voices to a whisper. Let the heavy gavel be laid down. Let the iron bars dissolve into mist. Let the fire in the glass pipe flicker and die out, leaving only the cool darkness of the night. We offer a whisper of empathy for the broken. For those who are still out there, wandering the streets, chasing the ghost. For those who are locked away, counting the cracks in the ceiling. For those who are sleeping in graves marked and unmarked. And we offer a hope that in understanding the darkness of the past, we might find a gentler light for the future. A light that is not the harsh amber glare of the street lamp, nor the blinding flash of the dopamine rush, but the soft, steady glow of the morning sun rising over a city that is healing. A light that reveals the truth without burning. A light that allows us to see each other not as threats or customers or statistics, but as fellow travelers on a difficult road. The river flows on. The water moves toward the sea. The stone rests at the bottom, covered in green. The night is quiet. The story is told. Sleep now, in the knowledge that the storm has passed, and though the world is changed, it is still here, and so are we. The echoes in the asphalt are fading, replaced by the sound of our own breathing, slow and steady, carrying us into the dream of a new day.